Sirens won't save you if the warning comes from space.
A viral claim says NASA has detected signs that North America is edging toward its worst disaster in 300 years.
Soon, wildfires in winter, billion-dollar floods, and quakes that shatter daylight may be the opening act. Is it the big one, a megastorm, or something no one sees coming?
Let's connect the dots, test the science, and show you what happened and what might happen.
Number 10, the Los Angeles County wildfires. California is no stranger to wildfires.
But what happened in January 2025 was unlike anything the state had seen before.
Winter is usually the calm season. Cooler air, a bit of rain, and time for the landscape to recover.
Instead, Los Angeles County found itself in the middle of a fire disaster. So destructive, it has already been labeled the costliest U.S. disaster of the year. The conditions leading up to it were alarming.
Weeks of unusually dry weather left brush and hillsides brittle.
Then came strong desert winds that turned the landscape into a giant furnace.
Once sparks took hold, flames tore through canyons and into suburbs with frightening speed.
Fire crews described it as a wall of fire that moved faster than they could set containment lines. Neighbors had minutes to evacuate, often leaving with nothing but their car and whatever they could grab in a rush. When the firestorm was finally under control, the damage was staggering. Thousands of homes and businesses had been reduced to ash.
Entire neighborhoods, once filled with tree-lined streets and busy shopping centers, looked like war zone.
The official estimates put the losses at around $53 billion, with about $40 billion insured.
For many families, that number meant little. Insurance can't bring back heirlooms, community landmarks, or the sense of safety that was lost.
The human impact stretched far beyond burned buildings. Tens of thousands of residents were displaced, some moving into crowded evacuation shelters while others scattered across the state. Smoke blanketed Los Angeles for days, pushing air quality to hazardous levels and creating a public health crisis for children, the elderly, and anyone with breathing problems.
What unsettled experts most was the timing.
California has always had a fire season running from late summer into fall when heat and drought peak. But this was January, the middle of winter.
It raised a chilling question. If wildfires of this scale can erupt in what should be the wettest part of the year, does California even have a safe season anymore? The Los Angeles County wildfires of January 2025 weren't just another chapter in California's fire history. They marked a turning point. Proof that in a warming world, even winter can burn. Number 9, the Tibet earthquake.
Just days into the new year, disaster struck in one of the most remote and rugged parts of the world. On January 7, 2025, a powerful magnitude 7.1 earthquake rattled Tingri County in Tibet, a high-altitude region of China that sits near the towering Himalayas. This wasn't a quick tremor that passed unnoticed. It was violent enough to send shock waves across the plateau, toppling homes, cutting off mountain roads, and leaving villages in ruins. The quake hit in the early morning when many people were still inside their homes. In rural Tibet, most houses are built from stone and mud brick materials that can't withstand major shaking.
Walls crumbled in seconds. Entire clusters of buildings pancaked, trapping families inside.
Official numbers later confirmed around 126 deaths, though many outside observers suspected the toll could have been higher given how isolated some communities are and how difficult it was for rescue teams to reach them. Hundreds more were injured, many with broken bones and crush injuries that required urgent medical care.
Rescue efforts faced enormous challenges. Tingri County sits in one of the world's most inaccessible landscapes.
High mountains, thin air, and winter weather that makes flying helicopters risky.
Roads were cracked, landslides blocked key passes, and communication lines went down almost immediately after the quake.
Relief teams had to battle not just collapsed infrastructure, but also freezing conditions as they tried to reach survivors. For days, many villages had no outside help, relying on neighbors to dig through rubble with bare hands. The damage wasn't just to homes. Local monasteries, schools, and health clinics suffered structural collapse. Power lines were knocked out, and water supplies were contaminated by landslides. For an already vulnerable region with limited resources, the earthquake was a major setback. Many survivors were forced into makeshift camps, huddled in tents against sub-zero nights, unsure when or if they would be able to rebuild.
Number 8, the Oklahoma wildfire outbreak. Mid-March is when most of Oklahoma is bracing for the arrival of spring storms and tornadoes.
But in 2025, the state faced a very different kind of disaster.
Between March 14 and March 18, a series of fast-moving wildfires erupted across the plains, turning wide stretches of grassland and farmland into scorched earth. It became one of the worst wildfire outbreaks in the state's modern history.
The fires ignited under near-perfect conditions for disaster.
Days of high winds swept across the plain,
gusts reaching 60 miles per hour in some areas. Temperatures soared higher than usual for March while a lawn-gunning drought had already dried out vegetation. When sparks caught in these conditions, flames spread at terrifying speed. Within hours, walls of fire were racing across counties, jumping roads and bearing down on rural towns. By the time the outbreak was finally under control, more than 170,000 acres had burned.
Entire neighborhoods on the outskirts of small towns were destroyed. Reports confirmed that at least 4 people lost their lives, while dozens more were treated for burns and smoke inhalation.
For a state that has always seen fire as more of a Western problem, the scale of this outbreak was shocking. The destruction extended far beyond home. Hundreds of farms were devastated with barns, livestock, and equipment lost to the flames. Ranchers described watching helplessly as fire consumed pastures, leaving behind nothing but blackened soil. The economic damage ran into the hundreds of millions, hitting communities that depend heavily on agriculture. Fire crews from across Oklahoma and neighboring states rushed in to help, but they were stretched thin. Multiple large fires were burning at the same time, and the high winds made containment lines almost useless. Many families had just minutes to evacuate as flames closed in and shelters filled with displaced residents who didn't know if they would have a home to return to.
Number 7, the Punjab River floods. In August 2025, the Punjab region of Pakistan faced a disaster that unfolded slowly at first, then turned catastrophic.
Heavy monsoon rains combined with water releases from upstream dams pushed the Sutali Bees and Ravi rivers beyond their limits.
What started as swollen river banks quickly escalated into massive flooding that drowned entire districts, turning farmland and villages into endless lakes.
The scale was staggering. Reports confirmed that over 1,400 villages were inundated with houses swallowed up to their rooftops. Families scrambled to higher ground, clinging to rooftops or piling into boats as rescue teams navigated streets that had become rivers. Crops, which are the lifeline of this agricultural region, were wiped out in a day. Rice paddies and cotton fields vanished under muddy water, setting up an economic crisis that would hit farmers long after the water receded. Dozens of people were confirmed dead, with the toll expected to climb as recovery teams reached more remote areas. Thousands more were injured or displaced.
For those who survived, the loss wasn't just homes and possessions.
It was the destruction of livelihoods.
Generations of farmers watched helplessly as their land, their cattle, and their future earnings washed away. Relief operations struggled to keep pace. Roads disappeared under floodwaters, cutting off communities from aid.
Schools and mosques were converted into makeshift shelters, crammed with families who had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Food shortages hit quickly as both supply routes and local crops were destroyed.
Clean drinking water became another emergency, with stagnant pools raising the risk of disease outbreaks.
By the end of August, large parts of Punjab remained underwater and the damage stretched far beyond immediate losses.
Families displaced by the floods faced months of uncertainty, while the agricultural collapse threatened to ripple across the country's food supply.
For Pakistan, it was another reminder of how fragile life can be in the path of an intensifying monsoon. Number 6, the Kishwa cloud burst and flash flood. High in the mountains of Jammu and Kashmir, thousands of pilgrims were making their way along the rugged paths of the Makil Mataya Yatra in August 2025. It was supposed to be a sacred journey through valleys and rivers. But on August 14, a sudden cloud burst above Kishto district transformed the pilgrimage into one of the deadliest natural disasters India has faced this year. The rain came down in sheets, far heavier than anything normal. In a matter of minutes, torrents of water tore down the slopes, carrying rocks, mud, and debris with them.
Camps set up along the river banks stood no chance. Entire tents filled with sleeping families were ripped away. Bridges collapsed, and vehicles parked along narrow mountain roads were tossed like toys.
The sheer force of the flood was described as a wall of water, fast, violent, and impossible to outrun.
When rescue teams finally pushed into the area, the devastation was overwhelming.
At least 60 people were confirmed dead, and over 200 were reported missing in the chaos. Many of them were pilgrims who had come from distant states, adding to the heartbreak for families waiting hundreds of miles away with no news.
Survivors told of being swept downstream, clinging to trees or rocks until help arrived.
Entire groups vanished without a trace, carried away by the raging waters. The challenge for rescuers wasn't just the scale of destruction, but the terrain itself.
Kishto was remote with narrow landslide-prone roads that were now washed out or blocked by debris. Helicopters fed in supplies and lifted the injured to safer ground.
But weather made flights sporadic. For days, the disaster zone was cut off, forcing survivors to huddle together in freezing nights with little food or clean water.
Number 5. The Central Texas Floods.
Texas is no stranger to floods, but what happened in July 2025 was on a completely different scale. A mix of relentless rainfall, swollen rivers, and dam releases turned central and southern parts of the state into an inland sea. Communities from Austin to Houston found themselves underwater. And within days, it became clear this wasn't just another flood. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in Texas history.
The rain fell in staggering amounts. Some areas recorded more than a foot in less than 48 hours.
Rivers like the Brazos and the Colorado swelled beyond their banks, pushing water into towns and highways. Dams already at capacity were forced to release water, which only worsened the flooding downstream. Streets became rivers, cars disappeared beneath brown currents, and families scrambled to rooftops waiting for rescue. The human toll was devastating. At least 135 people lost their lives, and the number of displaced residents reached into the hundreds of thousands.
Emergency services were stretched to their breaking point. Helicopters plucked survivors off roofs while boats navigated neighborhoods where street signs poked out just above the surface.
Shelters overflowed with evacuees who had escaped with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing.
The infrastructure collapse made everything worse.
Power grids failed in multiple counties, leaving tens of thousands without electricity in the middle of a sweltering summer. Major highways were washed out, isolating entire communities and stalling relief efforts. Hospitals were pushed into crisis mode as floodwaters reached their doors and clean water supplies were contaminated, raising fears of disease outbreaks. The scale of property damage is still being calculated, but the numbers already run into the billions.
Entire suburbs will need to be rebuilt.
Families whose houses took on several feet of water are facing the reality that mold and structural damage will force them out for months, if not permanently.
Number 4. The Pakistan Monsoon Floods. Every summer, Pakistan braces for the monsoon. The rains bring life to farmlands, fill reservoirs, and power the country's agriculture.
But in 2025, the monsoon turned from a seasonal necessity into a national disaster. Starting in June and peaking in August and September, relentless downpours battered province after province, triggering floods that left a trail of destruction across the country. The numbers tell the story of just how massive this disaster was. More than 1,000 people were killed and millions were forced from their homes.
Entire districts in Punjab, Sindh and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa were submerged with families wading through chested water to reach safety. In Balochistan, villages were cut off completely.
Their roads washed away and communications severed for weeks. Pakistan was a country divided not by borders but by water. The floods struck hardest in rural communities where most houses are built from clay and brick. These structures crumbled under the force of the water, leaving families without shelter. Crops that had just begun to ripen, rice, wheat, cotton, were wiped out in days, erasing livelihoods for millions of farmers. Livestock drowned by the thousands, and food shortages quickly spread beyond the flood zones, driving up prices nationwide. The humanitarian crisis that followed was staggering. Overcrowded shelters popped up in schools, mosques, and government buildings while aid organizations scrambled to provide clean drinking water and food. With sanitation systems overwhelmed, disease outbreaks became a major concern. Health workers reported rising cases of cholera, diarrhea, and skin infections as families struggled to survive in muddy, stagnant conditions.
Number 3, the Herat Badghis earthquake. On the last day of August 2025, Afghanistan was rocked by one of the deadliest earthquakes in its recent history.
A magnitude 6.3 quake struck the provinces of Herat and Badghis in the country's west,
an area already marked by poverty and fragile infrastructure.
Though moderate in size compared to some of the world's largest quakes, the shallow depth and proximity to densely populated rural communities made it catastrophic. The shaking began in the morning, catching many families inside their mud brick homes. These traditional structures common across rural Afghanistan have little resistance to seismic forces.
Within seconds, entire rows of houses collapsed, trapping people under tons of debris.
By the time the dust settled, the scale of the disaster was horrifying. Around 1,400 people were confirmed dead and thousands more were injured. In village after village, survivors were forced to dig through rubble with bare hands, desperate to pull loved ones out.
Rescue efforts faced immediate obstacles.
Roads into the affected areas were cracked, blocked by landslides, or simply too narrow for heavy machinery to pass.
Afghanistan's already limited emergency response system was overwhelmed.
Local hospitals filled up instantly, treating crush injuries, fractures, and head trauma with minimal supplies. International aid began to trickle in, but political instability and security concerns slowed coordination. For many communities, help arrived only after days of waiting. Beyond the human toll, the destruction of infrastructure left thousands homeless.
Families camped in open fields, huddled in makeshift tents against the blazing daytime heat and the cold desert nights.
Clean water was scarce and fears of disease outbreaks grew as sanitation systems failed. Schools, markets, and mosques lay in ruin, stripping away not just shelter, but the core of community life.
Number 2, the Sargoing earthquake.
On March 28, 2025, Myanmar was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes of the decade. A magnitude 7.7 quake ripped through the Serang region, a central part of the country where millions live in densely packed towns and villages.
The shaking was so violent that buildings hundreds of kilometers away swayed.
But it was the communities near the epicenter that bore the brunt of the destruction.
The quake struck without warning in the middle of the day. Streets split open, power lines snapped, and homes built of brick and concrete crumbled into dust. In just minutes, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble.
The official death toll quickly climbed into the thousands, with at least 3,600 people confirmed dead and some estimates placing the true number closer to 5,000. More than 11,000 were injured, overwhelming hospitals and forcing makeshift clinics to spring up in schools and courtyards.
Infrastructure took a massive hit. Bridges collapsed, roads were torn apart, and key government buildings, temples, and markets were flattened.
Water supplies were cut off in many towns, leaving survivors desperate for clean drinking water.
Communication lines went down, plunging entire districts into isolation. For days, people relied on word of mouth and small radios to understand the scale of what had happened. Rescue efforts were heroic but chaotic. Local residents dug through rubble with shovels and bare hands to pull survivors out. International aid agencies rushed in, but damaged airports and blocked roads slowed everything down. Thousands of families were displaced, crowding into temporary camps where food, blankets, and medicine were in short supply. Nights were spent in the open under tarps with aftershocks shaking nerves and crumbling whatever structures remained standing. The economic toll of the disaster was estimated at around 11 billion. A crushing blow to a country already struggling with political instability and poverty. Entire industries from farming to trade were disrupted as transportation networks collapsed. Number 1, Super Typhoon Ragasa. Late September 2025 brought a storm so powerful it dominated headlines across Asia. Super Typhoon Ragasa forming over the western Pacific. It quickly intensified into a monster system with sustained winds strong enough to rip roofs from concrete building and storm surges tall enough to swallow coastal towns. By the time it barreled across the Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and into southern China, Ragasa had etched its name among the most destructive typhoons of recent years. The Philippines felt the first brutal impact. Coastal provinces were hammered by winds that shredded homes like paper,
while inland areas were drenched by torrential rains that triggered landslides.
Entire villages were buried in mud and rivers swelled until they consumed farmlands and bridges. Rescue crews worked in dangerous conditions, wading through waist-deep water to pull stranded families to safety. The storm left widespread power outages, cutting millions off from communication in its wake.
From there, Ragasa set its sights on Taiwan. The island's mountains turned heavy rainfall into flash floods that swept through valleys and small towns.
Roads crumbled under landslides, isolating entire communities. Airports and seaports shut down, grounding flights and halting trade.
Cities faced blackouts as the grid faltered under the strain of wind and water.
For Taiwan, Ragasa was not just another storm. It was a direct hit that tested every line of defense.
Hong Kong and the southern coast of China were next. Authorities moved over 2 million people to safety in one of the largest mass evacuations in recent memory. Even with those precautions, the damage was severe.
High-rise windows shattered under the pressure of flying debris. Coastal towns vanished beneath surging tides.
Fishing fleets were destroyed and warehouses storing food and goods were flooded, creating shortages almost immediately. At least 40 people were confirmed dead across the region in the early counts, and the number of injured soared into the thousands. For survivors, the storm left more than physical scars.
Families lost homes, livelihoods, and in some cases, entire neighborhoods to a single night of wind and water. That's it for today. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more quality content.